The biblical Israelites had a unique conception of God. They believed that there was only one God and that he was without form. Their religion was one in which it was forbidden to anthropomorphize God. Christianity has its roots in the monotheistic religion of the Israelites. Yet, in spite of the Old Testament's unequivocal teaching that God is one, and not a man or a son of man, Christians have asserted that the God of the Israelites is a Trinity, and that Jesus the Son of Mary is the second person of that Trinity. Others have claimed that Jesus is actually the Old Testament God in human form. In all their history, the Jews have never understood God as being triune. The very idea of God taking on human form is completely alien to their religion. Yet, there are Christians who assert that these ideas are founded on the Jewish scriptures. The Christian idea that God incarnated into Jesus of Nazareth is far removed from the strict monotheism of the Old Testament. It is an erroneous doctrine and it stands contrary to what the Bible plainly teaches concerning Jesus. This will be demonstrated through numerous proofs from the New Testament. Proof number 1. Jesus had a genealogy. Jesus' genealogy is written about in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Jesus, being the Messiah, was also called the Son of David. We read this in Matthew 9 verse 27, and again in Matthew chapter 21 verse 9. Paul also calls Jesus as a descendant of David in Romans 1 verse 3. The eternal God simply does not have a lineage or human ancestry. It would be absurd to think a descendant of David is God, or vice versa. Proof number 2. Jesus had a mother. The Bible makes it clear in numerous passages that a woman, Mary, is the mother of Jesus. For example, Matthew 2 verses 11, 13 and 14 and Acts 1 verse 14. As obvious as it may sound, the mother-son relationship between Mary and Jesus is, by far, one of the most potent arguments against Jesus' godhood. If Christians insist Jesus was God, then it logically follows that they must accept Mary as the mother of God. The truth is that Mary did not give birth to anything other than a mortal human being. Proof number 3. Jesus was likened to Adam. In Romans 5 verse 15, Paul likens Jesus to Adam, the first man, by writing, quote, "For if the many died by the trespass of the one man, how much more did God's grace and the gift that came by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ." Obviously the man in the first part of the verse refers to Adam, whose sin supposedly caused death to enter the world. And later, in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 45, Paul calls Jesus the last Adam. If Jesus was God, why would Paul liken God the Son to Adam, a being that God created? Proof number 4. Jesus ate and drank. In Matthew 11 verse 19, Jesus says he came eating and drinking. How can a man who ate and drank be God? Does God eat and drink? Proof number 5. Jesus felt hunger and thirst. Jesus felt hungry. We read this in Matthew 4 verse 2, and later in Mark 11 verse 2. In John 19 verse 28 we read that Jesus, while on the cross, felt thirsty. God obviously does not feel hungry or thirsty. God has no needs. And since Jesus felt hunger and thirst, he was a human like us. He could not have been God. Proof number 6. Jesus called himself a man. In John 8 verse 40 Jesus himself states he is a man who speaks what he hears from God, no different from previous prophets. The Trinitarian claim that Jesus was fully God and fully man has no foundation in the Bible. Proof number 7. Jesus was seen as a prophet. In Matthew 21 verse 46 Jesus was seen as a human prophet. The Israelites always understood prophets as mortal human messengers of God who were not, in any way, divine. Proof number 8. Jesus was a human mediator. 1 Timothy 2 verse 5 makes it clear that there is one God and Jesus is only a man who mediates between God and mankind. Proof number 9. Jesus was a man with God-given authority. In Matthew 9 verse 8 we read that Jesus was a man whose authority and power came from God. Jesus reiterates the same point in many other passages. Proof number 10. Jesus was accredited and appointed by God. In Acts 2 verses 22 we read Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God. Later in Acts 17 verse 31, Jesus is said to be a man who was appointed by God. In the past God accredited and appointed many prophets to carry out various tasks. That does not make the prophets divine, the same applies to Jesus. He was not God himself but rather an agent of God. Proof number 11. Jesus is called a Son of Man. In Mark 8 verse 31, Mark 2 verse 10, Matthew 9 verse 6 and Luke 5 verse 24 Jesus is called the Son of Man, which was a phrase applied to humans in the Old Testament. Why would God ever be a son of man? God in the Old Testament categorically denies being a man or a son of man. There is no question of a son of man being God. Proof number 12. Jesus was subordinate to God. We see this in Romans 15 verse 6, 2 Corinthians 11 verse 31, Ephesians 1 verse 3 and 17, Ephesians 3 verse 14, and Colossians 1 verse 3. The New Testament routinely states that God and Jesus are separate persons and that God is also the God of Jesus. This refutes the notion that Jesus is God or in any way co-equal with God. In 1 Corinthians 11 verse 3 Paul teaches that God is superior to Christ. How then can people insist that Jesus is himself God? Proof number 13. Jesus taught to worship and pray to God. In several instances Jesus directed all worship only to God, who he called the Father, and not to himself. In Matthew 4 verse 10, Jesus rebukes Satan by saying worship the Lord your God, and serve him only. Then in Matthew 6 verse 6 Jesus instructs his followers to pray to the Father, not the Son or the Holy Spirit. Then in John 4 verse 23, Jesus says the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. Very clearly Jesus never demanded worship for himself. Instead his message was to worship the Father. Proof number 14. Jesus submitted to God's will. In Matthew 26 verse 39, Jesus prayed to God and ends by saying, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." Hebrews 5 verse 7 also highlights Jesus' submission to God. God is sovereign and submits to nobody. Jesus on the other hand submits to the will of God, which demonstrates that Jesus was subordinate to God, and therefore could not have been God in any way or form. Proof number 15. Jesus emphasized doing the will of God and not his own. This is made clear in John 4 verse 34, Matthew 7 verse 21 and John 6 verse 28. Jesus found it important to do the will of God and taught the same to others. Proof number 16. Jesus said God is greater than him. We read this in John 14 verse 28 where he declares, quote, "The Father is greater than I." This notion is repeated in John 10 verse 29. A monotheist would know that there is nobody greater than God. And Jesus, who plainly states that the Father is greater than him, was not God. Proof number 17. Jesus was circumcised according to the law. In Luke 2 verse 21, Jesus was circumcised on the 8th day like any other Israelite child, as per Israelite law. Jesus kept the sign of the physical covenant God made with Abraham. Proof number 18. Jesus was presented to God according to the law. Again, like any other Israelite firstborn, Jesus was presented to God in the temple.